All right, let's begin. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ava Michael. I'm an AmeriCorps wildlife educator with the Nevada Department of Wildlife. And with me today is Julie Gabrielson. She is a conservation educator with the Nevada Department of Wildlife. And Julie will be helping me with monitoring everyone's questions and making sure everything goes smoothly today. Now, before we get started, let's go over a few ground rules. Now, first off, I want to thank you for joining the Nevada Department of Wildlife for a conservation education program. This is a family program and is rated PG. Profanity or inappropriate behavior will not be tolerated in the chat or Q&A box, and all questions in the chat box or Q&A box should be on topic. Failing to follow these guidelines will result in being muted in the chat or Q&A box or being removed from the live stream. Now today we're going to use the comment box during the presentation, and then at the very end we'll go over any questions you might have through the Q&A box. All right, so today we are going to be talking about conservation and how it relates to birds. Now there is a birding series. Most of these videos have been uploaded to our YouTube channel, so if you want to check those out, there's a lot of interesting birding series videos with a range of topics. So definitely check out our YouTube channel if you want to learn more from our birding series. All right, so what are we covering today? We're going to go over what the definition of conservation is, some of the impacts that we're seeing in Nevada, the importance of conservation, especially in Nevada, some conservation plans that have been enacted, and why we study birds over a lot of different other wildlife populations, as well as protected and priority bird species. And then we're going to go over some specifics. So we're going to talk about sage-grouse, pinyon jays, as well as ravens, and how conservation impacts them, their habitats, and some of the other wildlife species that they interact with. And then at the very end, we're going to go over what you can do to be a conservation participant and to be a citizen scientist. And then at the very end, we're going to go over any questions that you put in the Q&A box. But during this presentation, if I mention a bird that you have seen, I would love it if you could put in the comment box that you have seen that bird and where exactly you saw it. I know some participants come from different states, so it's always interesting seeing where they've seen these bird species and how far away they might be from Nevada. All right, so first off, what is conservation? So conservation is managing nature to protect species, their habitats, and the ecosystem. So I like to remember two words. It's very simple. Just remember preservation and protection. We want to preserve and protect our wildlife populations, our fishing populations, the habitats that they live within, and the full ecosystem, because we need those symbiotic relationships in order to promote those habitats and promote those populations. So conservation could be specifically relate to water, could relate to wildlife, and it could relate to the entire habitat. So conservation is a pretty broad term, but today we are going to be focusing on conservation as it relates to birding populations. All right, so what are some of the impacts that we have seen in Nevada? So Nevada is a very unique state. It is the driest state in the United States, only getting about 9 inches of annual precipitation, which is not much to promote wildlife. However, there is a lot of biodiversity in Nevada. There's a lot of different unique adaptations that we see in our wildlife populations, so that way they can live in these dry habitats. But another impact that we are seeing is mining. Now, mining is vital to Nevada's economy, so it's very important part of Nevada. However, it does come with some consequences to our habitats and our wildlife populations. And Nevada has also been among the fastest growing populations in the United States for most of the past 2 decades. So because of that development and that human interaction, we're seeing a lot of changes in our habitat and in our wildlife populations. So what are some of the results of these impacts? Well, we're seeing habitat loss, which means a loss of wintering and migratory habitat for those bird species. Also, modification of the landscape. A lot of our habitats have been fragmented and divided, so that way wildlife populations are not able to travel quite as well as they used to be able to. And sometimes they have to go through those developed areas, and we're seeing more interaction with people because of this. Now, also another result of this is urban sprawl, a lot of developed areas, a lot of changed landscape. We're also seeing damming of waterways or groundwater pumping, which affects the overall water quality and water availability for those plants and those animals. And then mining. For mining, we're seeing a lot of changes, especially in the water quality and particularly with those open pit techniques that are often used. And then there's also a lot more invasives that we're seeing. So invasive plants as well as invasive animal species, which come in, and often they don't have those predators that they did in their native environment. So they are able to take over entire areas of landscape. With the invasive plants, often they will come in and because they don't have competition with other native plants, they will kind of kill out those native plants and dry out that area, take all the resources such as the nutrients in the soil, the space above and below ground, and a lot of the water available. So they often dry out areas, and because of this, we're seeing more fires and more wildfires. Now, conservation is very important for Nevada because Nevada is very unique in that 87% of Nevada's land is publicly owned and managed by federal and state agencies, which leaves a lot of opportunities for statewide conservation of those bird species and their habitats. However, balancing the recreational or balancing conservation objectives with recreational and economic application of public lands can often be a challenge. And it's something that conservationists and biologists really work hard to kind of create a balance between, because we want to promote the people that are living in Nevada and are living in these areas and around these habitats, but we also want to make sure that we're preserving and protecting those wildlife populations, the plant populations, and those overall habitats. All right, so there have been many conservation plans that have been put in place, but we're going to go over a few that relate to birds. So first off, we're going to talk about Nevada's Wildlife Action Plan, also called WAP. Now, WAP focuses on the species and habitats in greatest need of conservation, and this action plan was developed as a requirement to receive state wildlife grant funds through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for conservation of Nevada's wildlife. Next, we have Nevada Comprehensive Bird Conservation Plan, which was a joint effort to compile current knowledge of the conservation status of Nevada's bird species and their habitats. So it gauges conservation concerns, presents useful conservation strategies, and it was developed for a wide variety of agency and private partners, and it evolved from a planning team of representatives from the Great Basin Bird Observatory, also called GBBO. I'll talk about them a little bit more throughout the presentation. And then also Nevada Department of Wildlife, or NDOW, and the entire Nevada Partners in Flight Working Group. All right, next we have the Migratory Bird Species Act. Now this prohibits the taking of protected migratory bird species without prior authorization by the Department of Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So this means no killing, capturing, selling, trading, or transport of these bird species without authorization. So there are many birds or migratory birds that are listed on the site. You can go to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife site if you want to get more information on exactly which species of birds are being protected by the Migratory Bird Species Act, but it's very interesting. There's a lot of birds on that list, and it also gives you more information about those birds. So What birds are accounted for in Nevada? Well, there are over 480 recorded species, so there's a lot of bird populations, which is part of why birding conservation is so important in Nevada. And 300 species have nested or regularly visit Nevada, and 252 are known to nest within Nevada, whereas 46 are not known to nest within Nevada. Now, a majority of Nevada's breeding birds are land birds, but a large percentage of the priority species we will identify in a little bit are shorebirds, water birds, and reflect the importance of water bodies in this desert state. So why study birds? So in general, they are easier to monitor and survey than other wildlife groups. Often people will set up nets to try and trap them, and they're fairly easy to tag and collect data from, especially the smaller birds. But they're often a lot easier than, say, some of our larger mammals, and they often react quickly to habitat changes. So they're good at indicating what is going on in certain habitats, especially if you are able to tag them and track them and see exactly where they travel to within Nevada and other states. So they provide really valuable insight into the overall health of a habitat. So which bird species should we be looking at? We should be focusing on those indicator species. Now, indicator species are those bird species whose presence, absence, or abundance reflects a specific environmental condition. So these are very important species, and although they might not be considered priority species, they can indicate exactly what is going on in that habitat and how maybe habitat management is impacting those populations. So they indicate the overall ecosystem health. And even if those conservation priority species are absent, they are available to provide data to biologists and conservationists and those who are trying to manage habitats and those wildlife populations. So bird-focused conservation can be very efficient. Often it doesn't cost as much as, say, maybe tracking a large mammal, requiring that helicopter, those tranquilizers, and so on. But with these birds, they're much easier to capture. They don't require as many resources often. So they're very cost effective as well. Right now, priority species, those include state endangered, threatened, sensitive, and candidate species. So they're vulnerable animal groups. All right, so let's talk about those priority species. There are 78 priority bird species that have been identified, and they have been subdivided into 70 conservation priority species. And most conservation priority species were designated as priority species by regional initiatives because of population declines, significant threats, dependence on restricted or threatened habitats, or small population size overall. So there are 5 main stewardship species, including the prairie falcon, which you can see in this picture, the common orwell, gray flycatcher, green-tailed towhee, and sage thrasher. And then there are 3 special status species or species that were not ranked by regional initiatives, including the northern goshawk, ferruginous hawk, and golden eagle. So let's go over some of our protected bird species within Nevada as well. So first off, we have the Southwestern willow flycatcher. Now, this fun fact, the Empedonyx flycatcher is almost impossible to tell apart from the Southwestern willow flycatcher, and field biologists often use their songs to distinguish between the two. So if you are going to go looking for a lot of these bird species, sometimes the best way to find them is by listening for those songs that they make. because often that's the best way to tell them apart, especially if you are far away from them and don't really have a good view of them. But the Southwestern willow flycatcher is considered endangered, and its decline is a result of the removing, thinning, or destroying of riparian vegetation, water diversions, groundwater pumping, which alter riparian vegetation, and also overstocking or other mismanagement of livestock and recreational development have had impacts on this species. All right, next we have the Yuma clapper rail. Now this is considered endangered. And since the subspecies is so well camouflaged and usually found in dense vegetation, it is most easily recognized by its call. So similar to the Southwestern willow flycatcher, the best way to identify this is to listen for that distinct call. Now you can go onto the Audubon website and many other websites to find the calls that these specific birds make. It's always interesting kind of researching these birds because there's a lot of resources that can show you or that can explain the differences between these birds and help you identify them, and also provide those unique calls and give you an idea of kind of the feather patterns or the coloration of these birds for whenever you do go out and find them. So some threats to the Yuma clapper rail include habitat destruction, which is primarily due to stream channelization and drying and flooding of those marshes. So they are considered endangered. All right, next we have the bi-state DPS of the greater sage-grouse. So this includes only the greater sage-grouse in Carson City, Douglas, Lyon, Mineral, and Esmeralda counties in Nevada, and in Alpine, Mono, and Inyo counties in California. So it's those specific areas that we are seeing that are have protected populations. Now, this population is considered proposed threatened. All right, and next we have the yellow-billed cuckoo. Now, this is proposed threatened, and the adult threats are birds of prey, hawks, falcons, and raptors. And for the eggs are threatened by other birds or rodents, including the blue jays and chipmunks, as well as the development of habitat by humans. That can impact those the eggs of this bird. All right, so let's get into some specific species and how these species, the conservation status of these species affects the conservation of the land and vice versa. So first, we're going to talk about the greater sage grouse. Now, this is a very common bird in Nevada. I'm sure many of you who do live in Nevada and maybe some of the other surrounding states will recognize this bird. All right, so this is the largest of the North American grouse species, and it's seen throughout the West. And it's also found in 15 of our 17 counties here in Nevada. And it's the most common grouse species in Nevada. So the range for this bird goes from central Washington, southern Idaho, Montana, and parts of southern Canada and Great Plains, south to eastern California, south central Nevada, southern Utah, western Colorado, and northern New Mexico. So these are also found in the foothills, plains, and mountain slopes, but predominantly they are found in sagebrush habitats, which is mostly what we're going to be focusing on during this presentation. But they are considered very social birds. You can see in this picture, often they will congregate, or annually they will congregate together with the males and the females, and this is called lekking. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but they are considered very social birds, and they are often found in flocks, especially the females. So some fun facts about sage grouse is that during courtship, they will make this bubbling pop pop sound. You can see in the picture that the air sacs are inflated on this bird, and this is a male sage grouse. And this is part of a dance that they will do with the females. And as that air is released from those air sacs, that's when they make that bubbling pop pop sound. If you go and see these birds whenever they are lucking, you can hear these sounds and kind of see the whole process. You can also go onto YouTube and look up some videos of this. It's very interesting, pretty entertaining as well. It's amazing that they're able to create these sounds just with these air sacs. They are also very strong flyers and can reach almost 50 miles per hour, but they can't fly long distances. So usually this is very short bursts of flight. And the first written account of this bird was by during the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1805. So their diet year-round consists of sagebrush leaves. They really rely on soft foods such as those leaves. Many birds will actually swallow small bits of gravel that act as teeth in their gizzard, breaking down hard foods such as seeds and helping them to digest those seeds and harder foods. However, for the sage grouse, they don't have that stone in their gizzard, and they really rely on those soft foods in order to be able to digest them. So during the spring and summertime, they will eat leaves, buds, blossoms, and insects. And at different stages of their life, they will eat different foods. So it really depends on the age and so on of this bird and what they will eat. But for the most part, they do eat leaves, especially sagebrush leaves. So some impacts that we are seeing is that historically they were very abundant across Nevada and the West. However, habitat loss of growing sagebrush has really impacted their population, and that loss of habitat has really impacted Nevada and some other states as well. Now, sagebrush habitat is very important for the sage grouse. You can probably tell from the name, but on the sagebrush steppe of the northern United States, they are found to inhabit those areas, and they inhabit sage steppe ecosystems, which covers about 186 million acres in parts of Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, South Dakota, and North Dakota, as well as the Canadian provinces of Alberta. So a lot of area is impacted by this. And sagebrush steppe is actually a type of shrub steppe. It's a plant community that's characterized by the presence of shrubs and usually dominated by sagebrush. So this ecosystem is found in the Intermountain West in the United States, and it's also found in the foothills, plains, and mountain slopes where sagebrush is present, or in mixtures of sagebrush, meadows, and aspen in close proximity. So this takes up a lot of area. Again, 186 million acres, which is a lot. So 3/4 of the sage grouse actually inhabit 27% of the range. So they really have an interdependent relationship, and sage grouse rely on these plants all year round for shelter, for food, and as their habitat. So they really rely on the resources that this plant provides, as well as this habitat. Now, we are seeing a lot of sagebrush loss, and this is partly because of ecosystem problems such as conifer expansion. So in the last 150 years, junipers and pinyon pines have expanded across rangeland, drying up precious streams and threatening that sage grouse. And in the Great Basin, conifers have expanded their range by 600%. So they've really had an impact on sagebrush habitat and have been progressively expanding into these areas. So also what we're seeing is development is impacting these sagebrush habitats, that loss of that habitat from buildings, from development and expansion, and so on. And then invasive plants have played another big part in loss of sagebrush, especially cheatgrass. Now, again, invasive plants, what they will often do is they will be introduced to an area, and whenever they are introduced to that area, they often don't have predators or competing plants that might prevent them from spreading. So the cheatgrass especially will come in and it will expand into those sagebrush habitats, absorb a lot of the water within the soil, take up a lot of the root space as well as the overhead space, and take up a lot of those resources that the sagebrush needs, especially younger sagebrush. Now, sagebrush, whenever it is first developing, as with many younger species, they require a lot more water, a lot more nutrients, a lot more space to develop. And whenever they don't have that because of those invasive plants, they are able to expand in their habitat. So cheatgrass really has had a negative impact on sagebrush overall. And because invasives like cheatgrass come in and take the resources, they actually kill off a lot of those native plants, which means that those native plants, they dry up. And whenever cheatgrass itself loses those resources that it once had because it's depleted those resources, it itself also dies and dries up and creates kind of a kindling effect for wildfires. So this is partly why we're seeing an increased level of fires, and fires can really, really impact those habitats and prevent the expansion of sagebrush habitats. There's also some other factors. I'm not going to get into those, but these are the main ones that we are noticing. So some conservation initiatives that have been put in place to mitigate these impacts includes the Sagebrush Initiative, or SGI. There's also been some federal and state agency initiatives, as well as some external initiatives. Now, these initiatives also often focus on the conifer encroachment, whether that means cutting down and removing those conifers and allowing the sagebrush habitat to kind of expand and be able to be healthy again, or monitoring sage grouse to see how their population is being impacted by their habitat and by those management methods, and also measuring the response to conservation initiatives. That's a very important part, especially because conservation initiatives, they often are changing, especially like biologists will often come up with a few different modes of conservation and see which one works best and collect data on each of those initiatives to see what went wrong, what went right, whether they need to change it based on climate conditions, on environmental conditions, or based on the research that they gain from wildlife populations or bird populations such as the sage grouse. So these are always changing. They're always changing their methods, and conservationists and biologists need to be aware of these changing factors and constantly collecting data to see how things are progressing. So overall, these initiatives often improve biodiversity, they improve agriculture. I know a lot of farmers, they will let their livestock go free range. So this really can impact farmers as well. And then it also increases Nevada's sustainability whenever we do have healthier habitats, because we don't have those devastated areas. Those healthy habitats are able to take care of themselves. So overall, it benefits sage grouse, their habitats, and it also benefits those wildlife populations and agricultural areas. So let's talk about lek. Now, lek is when males will gather to engage in competitive displays and courtship rituals known as lekking, to entice those visiting females. So this breeding period extends from March 15th through to May 15th, which is tomorrow. So some of you might have actually already seen this. Some of you Maybe we'll go onto YouTube later and look it up, but it's a very interesting process. And if you arrive before sunrise, often you can see this. So sometimes these populations will go to the same area. Sometimes they will go to a new area, whether that's because of predators, development, or so on. But often you can get into a group and go and see the lecking process. But this is when they make that sound with the air sacs and they do their kind of ritualistic dance to impress the females. All right, next we're going to talk about pinyon jays. So pinyon jays are medium-sized. They are considered crestless jays, and the pinyon jay bill is featherless at its base, hence the name gymnorhinus, meaning bare nostrils. So you can look at the scientific name. Oh, and I want to mention, if you are going to research some of these birds or some of these wildlife populations, sometimes the easiest ways to get a lot of resources online is to specifically look up that scientific name, especially since many of these species have different names or different common names. The scientific name doesn't change. So if you want to do your own research, I definitely encourage you to use that scientific name. All right, so the males and the females have that dusky blue coloring overall, and then they also have blue-gray bellies and dusky white throats. So some fun facts about this bird is that they will create permanent flocks with more than 500 individuals sometimes, which is an incredible amount of birds congregating together, but they will often breed and forage together as well. Now they do make a crow-like caw. If you do want to go find these birds, best to listen for that crow-like caw. And they also store pinyon pine seeds. Now this is a very important adaptation, not only for this bird, but also for the habitat it lives within. So pinyon jays will store those pinyon pine seeds, and they will actually expand their esophagus to carry about 40 seeds in one trip. And then they will fly with their throats bulging to a catching site, which is where they store their seeds. Now, pinyon jays are known for harvesting and catching those pinyon nuts in the fall and have co-evolved to be more important for pinyon pine dispersal. So these trees, they're not really able to spread their seeds very far by themselves. So they really rely on birds and wildlife populations to help them spread those seeds and spread that habitat. So pinyon jays, their main habitat is the pinyon juniper woodland habitat, and they are permanent residents of this area, but they can also be found within sagebrush, scrub oak, chaparral, and sometimes pine forests. Depending on their needs, they will go to these different areas, but they're pretty hard to predict overall. Pinyon jays, based on their needs, they will go to many different locations, which is why tagging and tracking these birds can be very useful to gain more data. Now, Nevada has about 50% of the global population of pinyon jays. So Nevada is very important overall for this bird. So it's very important to monitor how this bird and how their overall population is doing. So they are one of Nevada's fastest declining species. The Great Basin Bird Observatory has actually calculated that nearly 80% of the population has declined since 1970. So this is a huge decline overall. And range-wise, pinyon jay populations have been steadily declining an average of 3 to 4% each year for the last half century or more. So this is a lot. And there are different reasons why this population could be declining, but it is unclear overall, especially since this population, they go to different habitats, they are pretty unpredictable overall. So it's hard to exactly pinpoint what is causing this population decline. But there are some ideas, including fire suppression, There have been decades of fire suppression, which have impacted their habitats or the habitats that they travel to. And pinyon pine habitats have become denser, often older, which means that they could be weaker and less productive overall. So this could be having an impact on this population, as well as many other birding and wildlife populations that live within this habitat. Also, increasing temperatures could be playing a part, as well as water availability. But no one is exactly sure why pinyon jays are declining so rapidly. So there are many hypotheses, and research is still continuing about how these populations are doing and how the management and conservation initiatives that are going on within their area are impacting them. Now let's talk about the pinyon juniper woodlands. So pinyons and junipers, as well as these birds and some other birds within those habitats, have a mutually beneficial relationship with kind of a cash store effect. So again, these pinyon jays, they will collect these seeds, they will spread these seeds and help these trees or these conifer trees spread to these different areas. And then these trees also provide a lot of valuable resources such as shelter and food and so on. So they have a very interdependent relationship or symbiotic relationship. Now, a lot of research has gone into their relationship and how they impact each other. So the pinyon jays have been captured and tagged, as well as some other bird species, to see kind of how their population is doing, where they're traveling to, what resources they use, and where they can be seen. So biologists and conservationists will often glue on radio transmitters, and they will form models based on the data that they do collect. And from this data, they're able to figure out how best to manage these areas and manage these populations. So these findings do provide valuable insights for these birds, for other wildlife species, for other bird species, as well as for the habitat. So birds overall give very valuable insight into the best management practices, especially since these conifer trees and these habitats have been expanding into lower elevation sagebrush habitat for decades and impacting the sagebrush habitat and impacting the sage grouse and some other species. So it's important to understand how each of these species plays a part with each other, and how to manage them both to where we're not completely depleting these conifers, but we're also not letting the sagebrush habitat be depleted as well. So some participating agencies include the Great Basin Bird Observatory, the Bureau of Land Management, Nevada State Office and Stillwater District, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, U.S. Forest Service, and the Rocky Mountain Research Station. So a lot of different agencies are working together and working independently to figure out solutions to these conservation issues. We have the raven. Now the raven is a little bit different because I'm going to be focusing on how the raven impacts some wildlife species. All right, so the raven will often fly in pairs or small family groups. They're fairly social, but they are classified as perching birds or songbirds. And let me go back. All right. And they are incredibly intelligent and remarkably adaptable. So this is why I'm not really going to be talking much about how the conservation of their habitat impacts them, is because they are omnivores and they are scavengers, meaning that they really are not picky eaters and they aren't really picky about where they live. So they often can be seen rummaging through trash and living within within areas that have been impacted by people where maybe not a lot of native habitat is able to live because those habitat resources are no longer there. However, the raven is pretty resourceful, so it's able to find its own food sources and live in areas that might have been heavily developed by people. Now, they also have a very large population in the West, which is why we're talking about them within Nevada. They aren't quite as common in the East anymore, but their population has really been increasing in Western states, which has really impacted wildlife populations as well. Now, human development is a big part of why we are seeing that increase in raven population, because human development is actually providing more resources for the raven. It's kind of taking out competing animals, and it's just providing them a lot more food and food, shelter, and space to kind of thrive within. So Nevada is very heavily impacted by these ravens, mostly in the southern region, but they occupy the same habitats as the desert tortoise, which means that the desert tortoise has increased predation from the raven population. So the desert tortoise actually spends about 95% of its life in a burrow, which is its home underground. So it doesn't come out quite as much. However, the ravens have taught their young how to hunt the desert tortoise whenever it is a hatchling. So this is whenever it's still developing. Its shell still hasn't hardened. So its shell is actually pretty soft and leathery. And the raven parents are teaching their young how to puncture that shell with their beak and eat the desert tortoise from the top portion of its shell. So the desert tortoise is very vulnerable to the raven, especially since it doesn't have a lot of defense mechanisms against the raven. And it's just very vulnerable overall. And only about 2% of these hatchlings actually reach adulthood. So this does have a very big impact, especially since the raven population is increasing. And another thing, it also impacts other wildlife species, including the sage-grouse. Often they will go after the young of some other wildlife populations, such as the sage-grouse. So they really impact a lot of those native populations because they don't have a good balance anymore, because their population is just too big for their habitat to sustain them. So there haven't been a whole lot of conservation responses, but there have been some, including reduced access to trash. So some work has gone into cleaning those dump sites, preventing those scavenging populations from eating from those dump sites, and also covering dumpsters. Covering dumpsters can have a big impact overall, because you can see in this picture, dump sites, they have a lot of food within them, and ravens are able to just pick off that food, and it's almost an unlimited supply, but especially since people produce a lot of trash. So covering up those dump sites really helps wildlife populations overall. Federal agency disposal can have a big impact, especially since a lot of trash goes into that. And then private sector waste disposal can also have an impact, maybe not quite as big, but businesses and commercial agencies can do their part by covering their trash, making sure it gets disposed of, that it's not left in the open for such wildlife populations to kind of eat from. And another conservation response has actually been remote egg oiling. So egg oiling is done by drones. Drones will fly over these nests and put oil on these eggs. And the oil actually kind of suffocates these eggs and prevents them from hatching. So this has been used, not on a broad scale, but it has been used to try and mitigate these populations of ravens, because ravens are protected. So really not a lot of work can go into minimizing their population or culling them. So we want to protect the ravens, but we also want to protect and prevent prevent their population from growing and increasing. All right, so what can you do about conservation as it relates to birding? Well, wildlife and environmental education plays a huge part in getting people involved, especially with students. I know working with students, it can really promote them to learn more, to do their own research, to go out in the field and kind of see what is in their own backyard and what wildlife and plant and habitat they can find. So having that early set education experience where they are encouraged to go and explore wildlife and environment can play a big role in these conservation initiatives, especially getting people involved in volunteering. Now, also another thing is reducing pesticide and herbicide use. This can really help bird populations because pesticides and herbicides, once it gets into those water systems, often some of the smaller or lower species on the food or on the some lower species can feed the predator species and cause them to get the effects of pesticides and herbicides. So let's say fish species absorb those pesticides and herbicides, and then a predatory bird species, such as a peregrine falcon, comes in and eats that fish. Well, they're going to get the effects of those pesticides and herbicides, and pesticides and herbicide have actually been linked to the kind of the degradation of their endocrine system. And the endocrine system is where hormones are produced in wildlife and in animals. And this affects their overall fertility. So it has been linked. It's not completely defined, but pesticides and herbicides is believed to affect that endocrine system and affect the fertility of a lot of wildlife populations and prevent them from creating that next generation of healthy birds and healthy wildlife species. Also, another thing you can do is report bird band sightings. I know a lot of those bird bands can be very small. They can have very small lettering and numbering. So it's hard to kind of distinguish, but some of them you can read, especially if you have a good camera or good binoculars. If you are able to jot that down and send it off to a wildlife biologist with information on the location and say what the bird was surrounded by, maybe whether it was in a flock or by itself, it can be really useful. Now you can report that to the Nevada Department of Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, many other agencies who are able to pass that information along to the biologist who can benefit from knowing exactly where their tags are going. Now, also there are a lot of citizen science apps. So I'm going to get into that, but citizen science apps, it's a great way to get involved with birding, with promoting those wildlife populations, the plant populations as well, and allowing biologists to see exactly what is within that area and so on. Now, iNaturalist is a very popular app that is used. I know I've used it a lot. It's very helpful and it's considered a social network. So you can actually reach out to naturalists, citizen scientists, as well as biologists. I know I've gotten a couple of biologists who have joined in with some of the posts that I have made about a specific species and have actually corrected me on what that species was and given me more information. So if you do want to learn about what's within your area, maybe even if you're traveling and you want to learn about the native wildlife and plants within that area, this is a great way of doing it and connecting to some of the locals and some of the biologists who have a lot of information on that. Also, whenever you are posting and identifying these plants and animals, the iNaturalist gives you more resources to learn from. So it's a great way of learning more. And it also is a mapping tool. So whenever you do pinpoint or identify that animal or plant, you can turn on your location and exactly pinpoint where that is. So it's useful to kind of understand what is within that area. And also share observations of biodiversity across the globe. I know I've used it in a couple of different countries, and it was actually incredibly informative. I was able to connect to a biologist whenever I was in Costa Rica, and they were able to help me identify this animal. So it's a great way about learning more about different areas that you might not be familiar with. And you can use it on your phone. You can also use it on the website. Now here is an example of what the website looks like. You can see you can post observations, and then it'll show you what species you have been able to collect and kind of list them out with pictures. And if you click on those pictures, you can actually find out more information. It'll give you the characterizations. It'll show you on a map, on a global map, where these populations are located. So it's very informative. All right, eBird is another useful app. It allows you to discover different birds, and it allows you to keep track of maybe, say, some bird lists that you might have of the bird species you've been able to collect, and post photos, find sounds of these birds. And it's a global site, so you can use it in different areas, different states, different countries. And it's the largest birding community. So if you are interested in learning more about birding, this is a great tool to use to kind of to get started and to promote your understanding of bird populations. So this is considered a citizen science app. So you don't need to have a scientific background to be able to use these apps, learn more and gain more understanding of how bird populations are able to travel and migrate, and what's in your own backyard and what you could find on your own. So this is a very useful conservation tool as well. Again, naturalists and biologists can join in and kind of see what's within those areas. Now, this is a specific app to Nevada. This is a Pinyon J science or citizen science app that was started by the Great Basin Bird Observatory. If you want to look up this app, you can use this barcode at the top, or you can use the picture at the top to look up this app and kind of download it and gain more information about this. But you can register as a participant. You want to download the ESRI's Survey 123 app. Also, if you want to learn more about this app, or you're not quite sure exactly what it does, you can go onto the Great Basin Bird Observatory, or GBBO, website and learn more. This is an app that they started, and it was started to collect data. You can include information about the absence of flocks in pinyon juniper woodlands, and you can collect data throughout the state. But this was started in 2018 with the first radio telemetry study ever done on this species. And you can actually gain more of an understanding by going onto their website or going onto this app and seeing exactly how they interact with their environment and how they migrate. All right, so we went over a pretty broad overview of conservation and how it relates to bird populations. I still have that picture at the top of the screen if you do want to look up that app or if you need more time. But are there any questions that I can answer for anybody?
We don't have any questions right now, but we do have a comment from Kathy who said that she sees ravens or hears them routinely in Spanish Springs, just a few at a time, and they like to sit on the top of her neighbor's tallest tree. It seems that numbers in that area have increased a bit over the past couple of years, was her comment.
Yes, their population has definitely been increasing, and they often do use those perches to kind of look out for food and observe their surroundings. So they are very intelligent animals, and they do study what is going on within their habitat. And even if they're in developed areas, you can still kind of see them looking around, whether that's for food or to see if there's any threats. But they're very intelligent animals. All right, let's give it another minute just in case anybody has any questions. Oh, also, I do want to mention if anybody does have any questions in the future or even after this presentation, you can use my email. I believe it's attached, it's on the screen, but you can use my email. Feel free to ask any questions, or even if you have any pictures of the wildlife, that's always interesting to see.
And please make sure you fill out the survey at the end of this as well.
Yes, definitely fill out the survey. This really helps me understand where I can improve, what information people found useful. And it's just great to see who is getting involved with our webinars.
All right, well, I don't see any more comments or questions coming in.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Hope you learned about the variety of conservation initiatives that can happen within a state. So this was a general overview, so I definitely encourage you if you have any questions or if you want to learn more, there's many different online resources that you can use, whether it's federal, state, or independent agencies. If you're curious about certain species, especially, these are great tools. But thank you for joining me, and I hope everybody has a great Friday and a great weekend.